kids.
This is Learning to Dad.
I'm the cool dad. That's my thing.
With Tyler Ross.
But what I do have are a very particular set of skills.
I'm gonna have fun, and you're gonna have fun.
This is Learning to Dad with Tyler Ross. That's me, and I'm with Jeremy Elice. Jeremy, thanks so much for being here, man. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Tyler. It's great to be here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so we got introduced through a common friend, Tommy, who's actually been on the show, and he said he had a great conversation with you, so I'm really excited to talk with you. I did a little bit of research on you, and you have a hell of a itemized resume, like one of the more recognizable ones that you can imagine with, I guess, you're the VP of Original Programming at AMC when Walking Dead came out and Breaking Bad came out. You were involved with Mad Men, and you're working on TUT now with Kingsley. And I also understand that in addition to that history, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're kind of transitioning your career a little bit more towards writing.
So all of that's correct. I had a brief stint as an executive for 5 years at AMC, very fortuitous, sort of a happy detour that taught me as much about what I wanted to know in TV as anything. And I got to work with, some of the greats. Breaking Bad was a show that, I played a large part in putting on the air. And, Vince Gilligan, who created that show, as is everybody on that show, near and dear to me. And, The Walking Dead, which was the last thing I worked on there, was sort of a culmination of, like I said, 5 years there, but it sort of happened in that sense of sort of roll the dice on this and let's see. And sometimes I think that's when the most interesting things in life tend to happen. The only thing about the introduction that was a little bit off was TUT was a series that was from a few years ago for Spike and Paramount. It's okay. It was a limited series with, Ben Kingsley, which was amazing. I was in Africa, and there's actually, I think, a relevant story to that for the show here today, because I had a 8-month-old, my first kid at the time, which was, I didn't expect to be in Africa. And more or less when I came back from that, which was in 2014, heading into 2015, I had my own production company then for a few years, and I sort of had to make this choice about going back to writing, which was always a first passion. And again, you roll the dice. And so for the last 3 years plus, I've been out as a writer and a producer, and just looking to get the next one on the air.
That's amazing. That's part of what has inspired me to want to have conversations, is the idea of rolling the dice, that, you're so singularly focused as a career man to crush your work, to just be really great at whatever your chosen field is. And then suddenly being a parent is introduced to that, but you want to be great at two things now. So I'd like to go with a little bit more history on your professional career. I saw that you went to UCLA. Did you grow up in the LA area?
I grew up in New York. I'm from Long Island, New York, for the most part. And my UCLA was sort of my way to get out to Los Angeles and to sort of explore the movie business, which was something I've been interested in for a long time. So it was a bit of subterfuge there, although UCLA turned out to be, a wonderful school. I live now like a handful of blocks from there, so I still go back a lot and love it.
That's wonderful. So you knew leaving New York that you wanted to work in film and television, Hollywood, more or less?
I'm one of those lucky people who I think from a very early age had a pretty good sense of what I wanted to do. I think that the, job titles and descriptions sort of, materialized more along the way. And sometimes, you sort of zig and zag to get where you need to go. But yeah, I quite specifically picked criteria for college that I knew could only end up in like UCLA. It was like UCLA, Rice University, and I think like Miami or something. And I sort of knew that of those three, like, UCLA would be the one that it would make sense to my parents, reluctantly, admittedly, because I had said NYU, and they were like, no, you got to get out of the city. You spent too much time. And I thought, all right, fine, happy to go cross country. And God bless them, since we're here talking about dads and parents, they, paid for my school, and I was very lucky. So
that's wonderful. When I was visiting colleges, I got to visit UCLA, and oh my gosh, was it a jaw-dropping experience just being in Westwood and just the campus and the goodness, beautiful people everywhere.
Oh yeah, I mean, and if you come, in that springtime, it's crazy. Like right now, it's you think you're in sort of like I don't know, an Abercrombie and Fitch commercial shoot, and I remember on my orientation, like I was down in Westwood, which at the time isn't even as built up as it is now. It was sort of going through, the what do you call it? The not gentrification, but sort of just the town was sort of being renovated in a way, rebuilt. And anyways, they were filming The Nutty Professor there.
Yeah.
So like, my weekend in orientation, I'm watching, Eddie Murphy and his stunt double do like reverse wheelies in a Dodge Viper, filming a movie. And I thought, yeah, I'm good. I'm ready.
I'm in. So did you always want to be behind the camera, or did you ever have aspirations of being in front of it?
If I ever had aspirations of being in front of it, they were dashed in roughly 1980 something when a Broadway show called Little Shop of Horrors, which is equally a great movie, a great remake of a movie as a musical and a great Broadway show, had come to Broadway. And my uncle, who is also a writer and who had worked in advertising on Broadway for a number of years, was doing the commercial. And if you grew up in the tri-state area in the 1980s, you saw a commercial that ran for Little Shop of Horrors that was one of the first of its kind to employ the, outside the theater, like, Tyler, tell us what you thought. And you were like, oh my God, when the plant ate the person, I loved it.
Yeah.
And one of the people who did that was a woman standing in front of her entire family, which like included me, like up to here. And it said, we liked it so much this time we brought the whole family. And that was my mother. And she got royalties from that commercial, which, she was great in for years and years to come. I also had auditioned for that commercial for my uncle, and I was the one that I think people had the expectation would be in it. And my uncle had to call me up the next day and inform me that I was cut from the commercial because I was no good. And I would say that more or less ended my aspirations to act or be in front of the camera. I think you have to know your strengths in life, and mine has lied on the other side.
At least you got the courtesy of a no, as opposed to wondering for weeks and weeks.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because now here I am, decades later out there pitching, and as cynical as I can be about it, I sort of feel like I was, well prepped by my uncle when I was, 8. I got my first official pass. Sorry, kid. Sorry. It's not going to happen.
So you're born in the wool, ready for this industry. You come out of UCLA, and what's your first kind of work outside of UCLA once you graduated?
I'm like your classic example of not thought out decision when you come out of graduating, because I had come here for 4 years, but I was also a sort of dyed in the wool New Yorker at the time. I had, a girlfriend at the time who was going to be finishing college, and it was still the indie movement in the late 90s of New York. And I thought, I'm going to move back. UCLA was like my pilgrimage to Mecca. I've gone to the religious Holy Land and seen what it's all about, and seen behind the curtain and seen the wizard. And now I'm going to go to New York and make these kind of cool films that I grew up on. And I did that for a couple of years. The first job I actually took was, and the way I say it was a bad decision, was I graduated into the greatest job market in the history of, the modern world in 1999. And I took a job working at the Maury Povich Show, which was the first job that was offered to me. And if you ever want to have a podcast about, depraved television, let me be your leadoff guest, and I'll tell you about my year on the Maury Show. Which could disqualify me from the patriarchy, and I could be excommunicated from every religious organization. But anyway, so I did that for a year. I had friends who graduated, and they were like, you don't get sushi lunch and have a foosball table in the lobby. It was like the first iteration of the internet bubble. And I thought, no, I get yelled at for 42 hours a day and ship people in from the worst parts of the country and put them on television. What am I doing wrong? That's a whole other story.
All downhill from there.
Never. You know what it is? Here's the deal, kids. Never take the first offer. Go find out what you're worth. So I did that for a number of years. I actually did get to work production in New York. I did a bunch of indie production. I learned to pull focus as a second AC and a camera unit, and sort of shot in Brooklyn, shot in Wallingford, Connecticut, and was sort of doing all these things and having a blast. And then frankly 9/11 happened. And I was there for 9/11. I was actually working, downtown because, I had to make ends meet. So I would I would temp for money. And it was election day. So I was down there, doing polling. And I was right in the, shadow of the World Trade Center. And I had actually at 6:45 in the morning, as only, by the way, like a 23-year-old can do. I was like, let's bail. I'm going to go see my sister and get a bagel. And so I ended up moving to Washington Square Park. And I kind of always tell the story that throughout the day, I ended up moving north through the city. But by the time I had gotten to Washington, to Union Square, and had gone to see my friend and gotten that bagel, we had, gone to get the bagel. And in the span of time, the first plane had hit, and
Wow.
then 9/11 happened. And, I was in the city for that day and for several days afterwards. And I had actually been due to go out of town to Wallingford, Connecticut to film this movie. And my friend was the director of photography, and he had hired me. And he was leaving on September 11th, which, needless to say, he didn't end up doing. And I thought the job would be canceled. It ended up getting pushed a few weeks. So 3 weeks later, I found myself in Wallingford, Connecticut, in this like small town with, every porch had an American flag hanging on it, like in the wake of 9/11, filming this like indie murder mystery. And in the middle of it, I ended up getting like the flu and had to go back to New York for a minute. And it was weird because, I could tell as soon as I got back that the city had changed. I mean, it was eerily silent. I remember a fire engine went by and people started applauding. And then, 4 days later, I go back, I finished the movie. And in the span of that month, all the production jobs had dried up. There was, nothing else going on. And you certainly weren't running around New York City, on subway tracks or in buildings or, behind gated areas with cameras anymore. Because if you were, there was always a cop there going, what do you think you're doing? Get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
And so, it was like crossroads time, as is often the case in life. And, I had friends who were going to law school and friends who were doing, sort of what might be considered safer bets. And, and I sort of had to ask myself what I really wanted and decided to move back to LA. So that's how I got back out.
And so at what point did you have you've got 2 children now?
So I have 2 children. I had my first daughter, Vivian, 5 years ago. And I had my second daughter, Madeline, 20 months ago now.
Yeah,
so
congratulations.
This August. Yeah, thank you.
Still a
2
baby.
girls.
Yeah,
2 girls, yes.
That's wonderful. So 5 years ago, like at what point were you in your professional life? You felt pretty, like you weren't piecing stuff together anymore. You weren't temping anymore. You had, I guess, found your lane.
Well, yes and no. And it's funny. That's why I thought it'd be interesting to, do your podcast, because I like the sensibility that you have of combining sort of, people who've been entrepreneurial with, kind of, let's call it life quests, in this case being a parent. And, there's I don't know if it's Yiddish or whatever, but there's a expression that says, man plans, God laughs. And I think that would probably be how I would describe how I came to fatherhood. My wife and I were married. We'd been married for a few years. We knew we wanted to have kids. But in terms of my professional career, I had the success of AMC, but I had just recently transitioned to my own business as a producer at that point. I literally like lost my job because the company I was with lost their deal, and, sort of lived through that kind of professional fiasco for a minute, and came out the other side and thought, okay, this is the time. I'm going to roll those dice and bet on myself, which I've always wanted to do. And, I guess timing wise, probably right around that same week, maybe I was celebrating. Invariably, my wife got pregnant. And, so I found myself what I would call in a position that you would never counsel or advise anybody to be in. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like, sure. Like, start your own company in one of the most uncertain businesses, with the odds stacked against you, and by the way, have a kid.
Yeah.
At the same time, if ever there were some sort of jittery nights, but, but it taught me sort of early on that, I had a few victories in terms of, work, whether it was like signing a deal and then, signing another deal or eventually getting TUT made, that were, the things that make you feel secure because you either have a paycheck or you feel like, it's a job well done. But, then with every opportunity becomes another, a potential pitfall or setback. And I think that's a good that's a truth for parenting as well. And so what ended up happening was the network I worked for was like, you know what, they were literally like, Jeremy, you're absolutely right. Because we were talking creative. They're like, we got to do TUT authentically.
Yeah.
We're going to Africa. We're going to Africa instead of Montreal. Now, it wasn't entirely my idea. I mean, there were some other people who had that, but and this was in the middle of the SARS epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly I'm sitting here going, okay, I got to take 3 flights. Flying is not my favorite thing anymore.
Yeah.
I got to go to a place that frankly, I never thought I was going to go to. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I was like, oh, it was going to be the majestic of the Sahara. Like, if I want to see desert, I'll watch The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'll watch Lawrence of Arabia. But like, all right, but for work and for, movies, it's like, I love it. It's what I want to do. So off I'll go. But wait a second, SARS epidemic, and you're like, I have a kid. I'm going to go and bring back SARS really, it was all these things. And suddenly through the prism of having an 8-month-old and trying to figure out what the right decision was. And I guess in what's sort of become the theme of this conversation so far, sort of roll the dice. There it was on the New York Post one day, SARS epidemic in New York, like a doctor had brought it back inadvertently. And I thought, well, all right, we're going to New York because the kid's going to see his grandparents. So, pardon my French, but fuck it, that's what make the movie. They'll make the TV show. And so off I went, and I never would have imagined that I would have found myself, in Africa on a completely different time zone in a place that I've never been, working, shooting all day, and then calling, I don't even remember if I could FaceTime, but like calling my, 8-month-old daughter, who at that point could sort of say, hi, Dad.
Yeah.
And it was, I think it taught me, among other things, that, sometimes there's this notion that you can't always go after the things that you want in life. And I think that because they sometimes conflict with one another, or they sort of all can, be at odds with one another in terms of just say your timing. But I actually think that what that taught me is you don't have to accept that if in fact, you can do certain things to be more focused on what you really want and what's really important, and you can be just a little bit brave and have a little bit of overconfidence in yourself, then you can sort of get it done. And honestly, I can't think of anything that, better describes being a parent, or being a dad. So it's definitely a fake it till you make it, profession.
Yeah, I read a Martin Luther King quote this morning that was, even though you can't see the top of the steps, you still got to take the first stride. That's some paraphrasing of it. But I'm curious, for those that are listening that don't necessarily understand our industry, like as a producer, when you started your own company, like, what's your day-to-day look like? Like, what's your work day look like? Like,
sure.
prior to the birth of your first girl? So
one of the things in terms of parenting that I said, fortunately, when I started my business and I had a deal, was I looked at my wife and I said, knowing we had our kid either on the way at that point, or maybe she was born, but I said, one thing I consider myself very lucky and fortunate about is that even if it turns out this doesn't work out, I'm going to be, working and on my own terms, which at that point, I did know my own lane. I did know my strengths. And so I knew the way I like to work, and I knew that, I could align that with the things that I thought would be important as being a dad. And so I said, if nothing else, I'm going to get to be home with my daughter in a way that a lot of fathers I know who either had them when they were younger and they were less certain about their careers, or frankly have other professions that make different kinds of demands on their time in terms of like, certain hours in a day. And so, and that was one thing that served me in good stead, just kind of heading out. But to answer your question specifically about what my day was like or what a producer does. So when I went on my own, the job was not all that different than what you might be expecting from an executive, but with a greater degree of ownership and sort of creative stewardship, which is I was out there looking for material, self-generating ideas in some cases as original pitches, books, existing scripts, or in my case, relationships with writers that I had on the shows, any one of which might provide, the next kind of idea that moved me, or the next script that moved, hopefully me and other people. So, there's a book that I'm working on right now called The Journal of Best Practices by this guy, David Finch, who, by the way, would be an interesting father to have on. He's got a great story. But, I've been with this book for, 9 years. It's the story of a guy who was, diagnosed with Asperger's 5 years into a marriage by his wife. And it sort of actually was a great thing for him. But it led to this exercise called the Journal of Best Practices, which was this sort of self-examination of his relationship. And so, that was a book that I'd had for 5 years. And I first tried to get Legendary Entertainment interested in it when I was a producer for them. And they sort of were until they lost their deal with Warner Brothers. And then, it sort of, I had it for a minute under my deal with Starz, and it kind of, came and went. And along the way, I think there was even a script written for HBO that I wasn't involved in, but it's finding, the material that matters and trying to then convince other people to make it.
Yeah, so the things that mattered, did you feel like your perspective on those things changed once you had the experience of having a kid and going through the wife that was pregnant and holding your little girl?
Oh, I mean, there's no question. It's life-changing, in a way that to describe is utterly cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. I think it may have been on your show. Somebody said it, or maybe you said it, that I remember one time somebody talked about, and this is not a dig at anybody who doesn't have a kid, but you can't really understand your perspective on the world as a parent, if you're not a parent.
Yeah.
And again, it's not a dig. It's just that you suddenly have different lenses on. Yeah. What's required of you as a parent is different. And so, yeah, to some degree, there are things that, I would have a harder time, I think anything that involved, like I did a show called The Killing. And I think that, I wouldn't be squeamish about doing this, but I don't know that I would just use like the dead daughter in the trunk of a car as the catalyst for some sort of sordid story, unless I felt like, there was a greater tale to be told. I think there's an entertainment value in anything, but on just a personal level, that might be a harder story to deal with. I think you think a little bit more about promoting, ideas that feel a little bit more conscientious. Mm-hmm. But here's the other truth. Like I also, I love movies and I love television and books, and I really believe that most of life's mysteries are kind of answered in them. And I know what movies and television and books meant to me in my life growing up. And so I try not to sort of stand in the way of what is kind of just the sheer joy of experiencing something. Mm-hmm. There's an author who talks about, maybe it's Ryan Holiday or somebody, who talks about like blow your mind books. Yeah. And I think that those things sort of apply. And so, yes, being a father, I think changes my perspective on things, but the way I try to approach it is I'm just looking for different blow your mind books or stories. I'm not trying to sort of, I think it's a bad idea when we go back and kind of, I don't know, have a referendum on past behaviors or past beliefs. I mean, you're supposed to do that. You're supposed to believe different things in your 20s than you do in your 40s. Otherwise, how do you know you're getting any better or at least changing?
You've been involved in reading and finding and creating stories. It sounds like your entire life in the form of writing or developing or producing. So after having your daughter or both daughters, have you gone back and looked at an old story and thought, with this new perspective, I have a new appreciation for it? Like anything just jump right out?
Yeah, I think that there have been some stories that I went back to that I had written either early days that I thought, oh, maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. And then I went back and read it and I went, oh, no, that was bad. You weren't that talented. But in one case I thought, oh, it's funny. If this guy were father, I could see where the story would start to sort of work and would coalesce. And I don't think I would have ever thought that had I not had a kid. And on a kind of unrelated to the profession level, but, my parents recently delivered for me, some old things that I had written when I was, at this point, a little bit older than my daughter. I was probably 8 or 9, 10, 11 when I wrote some of these things in grade school, which she's just about to begin. So when I look back on that now, and when I know that I have those things to someday show to her and say, look what your father was working on. I think in a sense, that's the absolute magic of writing and writing things down and telling stories and, why they're so important or important to me.
Like back to, we talked about changing perspectives. What about changing practices, like with your work and owning your own company? Like how do you change the way, like what's your wife do? And she stay at home or she work?
No, my wife works. She stayed at home for maternity leave. She is, like I said before we started recording, she's a VP over at Showtime and she works in publicity. And we talked actually about, what having a kid would mean for her career, beforehand, sort of, academically, hypothetically, and then afterwards. And, to her credit, she knows she wants a career. She's been a person who's been committed to that. And it isn't something that has impacted her ability to be a committed mother. What I think works well for us is that we've had a balance in our relationship that even before I started to develop some of those routines that you just asked about, which I'll mention, I think worked for us because what I will say about, parenting that has, traditionally been sort of laid at the feet of women that occurred to me, I think even before I became a father, but definitely after I became a father, being a parent, and let me say it in the traditional sense, being a mother, that is a job. I don't mean that it's like the greatest job in the world, but that also requires like, the most for you to give of yourself. Like you cannot phone it in, not in the way that I think we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And so when I started to think about how me and my wife would, balance things, plus the fact that I had a business I was very keen on the idea of routines, and I'm not like a routine oriented person. I think I'm, if you left me to my own devices, I joke with my wife, if I hadn't gotten married, I'd be sleeping on the couch. And what movie was I watching last night? Oh yeah, I'll pick that up again. And what's for breakfast? It would be very, fly by the seat of your pants.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that in order to maximize, your time, which is of course, the first thing that occurs to you when you become a parent, you have to set routines.
Yeah.
I'll tell you. So here's a funny story that a guy told me that I think is a good thing to tell people when they're going to become a parent. He told me this. He said, I was pregnant, we were talking, and he had a couple kids already. And he said, all that stuff that you hear about how you have a kid and it changes your life. It does, but not in the way that people talk about it. It's not like, you're never going to have a night out with your wife again, or that, like, you're never going to see your boys and hang out or take a vacation or even have sex. Like, all those things are going to happen. You're going to have sex. Life will go on. You will get back to it. You'll have to find your way back to it, but you'll get back to it. And I said, oh, okay, that sounds good. He said, yeah. He said, is there anything that you like to do, for you? And I said, you mean like go to the movies by myself on a Friday, or like read the New York Times on a Sunday? And he said, yeah, you're never going to do that again. And I thought, every Sunday I go, that guy was right. I have not been, if me and my wife get to see a movie start to finish, it's a true miracle. But I do. But I think that, what that meant to me in terms of your question and how I approached it, because I knew that I needed to focus. And before I even got to this step, I will tell you, as I said a little bit earlier, like, you need to know what your priorities are. Warren Buffett has this great exercise. I think that there's a story, you could Google it, about him and his pilot, Steve, that was about making two lists. I think if you Google Warren Buffett and about making two lists, and it's interesting, I won't tell it all here, but he basically helps you figure out how, like, what are the 5 things that you should be working on? And his distinction that he comes up with is, once you figure out those things, most people think those are your priorities, and everything else that's, on the secondary list is, what you work on in between. It's the other stuff. And his whole thing is no, that's what everybody thinks, and that's totally wrong. The 5 things you work on are the only things you work on, and everything else, those secondary goals, that's what you don't work on.
Yeah.
Right. And so I had that mentality in terms of, a business, and I was, like I said, keen on podcasts and YouTube, where I found that there was a lot of long form type of advice that was great. I bought a lot of books and whatnot, but I really, knowing that being a parent was a job, knowing that, me and my wife were going to share those responsibilities, and knowing that I was intent on being a really involved dad, I truly set about devising routines and things that I think I had been trying to do in a kind of self-help, self-improvement way. So, whether it was like Ben Franklin's, 13 traits to improvement, or his methodology, or it was, David Goggins, or Jesse Itzler, or anything else like that, right?
Yeah.
I started to sort of think about that in the context of being a parent. And one of the things that occurred to me early on afterwards was, and I tell this to people now, you need to train to be a dad, right?
Well said. Well said.
You need to, like, physically and mentally, but I'll even just take it as a physical thing. It's just, it's funny how in some cases we're so ill prepared for the things that truly matter in life. Like, I can tell you what an Edgeworth box is in economics, and I don't know why, but like, nobody bothered to tell me that, like, hey, by the way, when you're going in and out of a car with a kid who's, growing from 5 pounds to 10 pounds, that thing in your back is real pain you're going to want to pay attention to, and it ain't going away because you're a fat, lazy asshole who hasn't done anything. Right? Now, you can either be a fat, lazy asshole dad who's going to keep having back problems, and I think, I don't have to spell it out for you where that goes, or like anything else that you want to accomplish in life, which for me was, being a producer and then being a writer. Being a parent sits above all of them, and I realized I need to train for this.
Yeah.
So, and you talk about change of perspective. So, before I had a kid, it was like, okay, I got to go to the gym, and this is the year I get the 6-pack, and this is the year I, take off the shirt, and I look like whoever, Brad Pitt, whatever, I'm trying to get there, whatever.
Yeah.
And after that, I suddenly went, okay, I'm almost going to treat myself like a person coming back from an injury. I need to learn how to, like, move again.
Yeah.
I'm going to be getting in and out of cars, be lifting things up, and then that extended to, okay, well, if I'm going to the gym, I can't go for 2 hours. I can't go for 90 minutes. Like, I got to get back. I can't leave my wife alone because she's got to get ready for work. So I got to maximize the gym. So, then all of a sudden Tim Ferriss with his advice about, here's your minimum viable weight, like.
Oh yeah, it's 80-20, 4-hour body. Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, it's like the great thing about the age we live in is, yes, it's the age of over information, but if you know how to sort of parse through it and sort for what you're looking for, I got tremendous advice, again, from the medium through which I make my living now, which is, movies and television shows that inspired me, but like, books, whether they were books that were written by Navy SEALs advice to their sons, which I don't have a son, or it was Michael Chabon's, Fatherhood for Amateurs or whatever it's called, just countless stories and things that, meant something to me. A great one, I think, that actually sort of exemplifies all we're talking about is the Will Smith movie, Pursuit of Happiness, because in that movie, he's, frankly, in much more dire circumstances than I was in, but he's a single father ultimately. He's working in an internship, at like Morgan Stanley or, some financial bank institution. And he's got no money. He ultimately ends up being homeless, and he has to go pick up his kid from like daycare. So he has to like leave work at like 4:30 in the movie. And, all the other guys are there till 7, 8 o'clock. And so he starts talking about these little things that he's doing, right? Like not putting down the phone in between calls, and he's not getting water so he doesn't have to go to the bathroom. Just these little micro, improvements that he can make to gain a little bit more time in his day. And so what I realized was much like in business where you go, well, somebody's out there working, you better be hustling. I realized like, it's not the same kind of competition, but if it's a competition with myself and for my kids and I want to do well, like how can I, devote that same focus and attention to sort of being a parent and to squeezing out the time so that I can, spend time with my kids and still write the amount of hours I need to write and, spend the time making phone calls and still get the oil change in the car. How can I do that? And I think that you can't do that if you don't really spend time thinking about it. I think if you're like watching the ball game or, still out, kind of drinking and, partying it up, at least in the early days, maybe if you're not starting a business or, maybe if that's your outlet, don't get me wrong, I'm not passing any judgment. People should have fun. I'm not saying my life is for everybody, but, those are the 5 things I want. I want to be a great dad and I want to succeed in my career, and I want to be a great husband. So I focus a lot of thought on it.
Yeah, it sure sounds like it. I mean, I'm looking forward to re-listening to this so that I can look up some of those books and pursue some of those things. I'm reading The One Thing right now by Gary Keller, which is a riff off of the 5 things, I suppose. But I'd like to get into a couple of just my kind of form questions and see how you respond to those.
Sorry for my long answers, Tyler. I apologize.
No, I appreciate it very much. It makes my job a lot easier, frankly. Yeah, let's get into, well, tell me about your kids. Like, are they like you? Are they like your wife?
They're terrible. You got to save me from them, Tyler. I can't. Wait, I think they hear me. My kids they're like me and my wife, to be honest. And, it changes in terms of timing. I think one of the joys of being a parent is when your kid does something and you realize, you see yourself in your kid, or you see your wife in your kid. I think in a kind of cosmic joke of the universe that's usually followed by you saying something that immediately stops you in your tracks and you go, oh my God, I'm my father, I'm my mother. How did I just do that? But I also think that's the beauty of kids, is like, it lets you in on, I think, a little bit of the sort of, cosmic wink, wink joke of life, and I think you get a joy out of that. That's sort of hard to describe. But, and my eldest is, before my eldest Vivian was born, I'll give you another movie reference. Forgive me, I'm a victim of my own.
Please bring it
profession.
On.
But James L. Brooks, one of the all-time great writers of all time, who wrote Broadcast News, the great 1980s movie about the now almost antiquated idea of a broadcast news network, which starred Holly Hunter. It begins where you see Holly Hunter and William Hurt and Albert Brooks as kids. It's a great introduction. And the introduction to Holly Hunter as a little girl is, there's this little girl and she's like 11 years old and she's sitting at her desk and she's sending out pen pal letters, and her father comes in. He goes, honey, it's time to go to bed. And she like screams. She's like, ah! She turns around. She's like, Dad, I told you not to sneak up on me. And he's like, all right. She's like, I only have one more to write. And he says, okay, fine, one more, but I don't want you getting obsessed. Kisses her on the head and he walks out. And she sits there for a second, like starts to write the letter, stops. You see her like tilt her head. Something's occurred to her. And this girl stands up. She's brunette. She marches out of room. She marches down the hallway and marches into her father's room, where the dad, who looks sort of like Chris Christopherson, I forget the actor now, is like sitting in his chair. You could tell he just wants to like kick back and relax. And she walks in with this great Southern twang and she says, "Dad, you're always telling me to choose my words. Well, then you go and drop a word like obsessive on me. Well, I'll look it up. And obsessive is a person who can't stop what they're doing. Well, here I am stopping what I'm doing to like tell you that." And like and the father's face is like, well, I don't even know what happened. And she like starts to walk out, and then she turns around and she walks over to him. She goes, "I love you. Good night." Kisses him on the head and storms out. When my daughter was in my wife's womb, I turned to her and I said, "That's your daughter. That will be our eldest." And to its large degree, that is my daughter Vivian. And my daughter Madeline, who is a year and a half, who's the baby, is she's our little, my wife likes to joke, our Leo baby. She's born in August, not to get too astrological, but she is, bold and brave and will try anything, loves music, is fascinated by instruments. Even that, it's like, I'm no expert. I am tone deaf, but I look at her and I think, is there really something there? And I don't mean it in a weird Hollywood thing, just like this idea that music connects with her in a way. I can just see it, that it's not the same for other people. So who knows? And so exciting.
It's amazing watching kind of I'm going to call them the natural inclinations of your kids. I have, my daughter, she'll go outside and sing, put on a performance just by herself. I'm like, I want to enable whatever it is that she's inclined to do. So I can totally resonate with that idea of just, not in the Hollywood way, but like in the way that makes them happy.
Yeah, well, in a way that could be so much more profound in their life, even if it ultimately is just a fine appreciation for it. But one of the things I love about being a parent is this idea of re-experiencing childhood, and sort of, but you're obviously experiencing it sort of somewhat removed. Yeah. So you sort of see it. I often feel overcome with like feeling of nostalgia when I watch my kids do certain things, and they're growing up in a very different city at a very different time, but there are certain things that are just universal truths about growing up and learning, and I'm endlessly fascinated by that.
You were talking about something that made me want to ask you about your childhood, because you were obviously very deliberate and thoughtful and hardworking and dedicated to being a great parent. So did you find that your parents are that way? Like what is it about?
They were terrible terrible people.
Yeah,
sorry, is this recording still? Sorry. No, I'm extraordinarily close with my parents now, and they were great parents. They were great parents. Like anybody, they were, human beings. Luckily, they're still together and they're still alive. Again, I'm very blessed in that way. Me and my father in particular, like we, butted heads. I mean, from 14 till, 20 something was tough. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, going to college helped our relationship a lot because I think there was a certain amount of distance that needed to be had. I think I was independent. We're both particular. Mm-hmm. You ask me about my kids now. I see that in my daughter. It's funny. We have a temper streak that runs through their family. I'm waiting for them to identify the temper gene because I'm going to lobby for them to name it after my family. But I'll tell you something that my parents said to me that I think is just astoundingly good advice. And they said, and it's funny. I think it's such good advice about being a parent that when they said it to me as a kid, when you're a teenager and you almost, nothing is getting through, right? Mm-hmm. When you're a teenager, it's just the wall of,
they're on the other side of the moon. Yeah, gone.
Yeah. And when we would, we had a very close family in terms of a lot of tradition that would keep me coming back. And, my parents were great about a lot of things that I think where it really counted made me know that even if we disagreed, they loved me. But the thing that my mother and father said to me that I thought was just brilliant was when cooler heads would prevail, my father would say to me, just remember that every time, because I'm the oldest, they would say, just remember that every time your mother and I go through something with you, no matter how old you are, no matter how many times we've been through something else that seems even similar, every time with you, it's the first time. They're like, every time, they're like, you could be 18, you could be 25, you could be 40. Every time as your mother and father, we're experiencing it for the first time. True, with your sister, sometimes it's different. There are some things that are the, firsts for her, mm-hmm. But, you will always have been our first. And we're learning. And I think it was one of those things that, really, which is so important in anybody's sort of maturation, that made me realize, my parents don't have all the answers, right? And that also that what they're doing is, at times might seem sort of mean or oppressive or just not fun. Like they're not doing it to be that way. They're just, kind of doing the best version of what they think they should be doing. And I, I follow that same example myself, and I fully expect to say that to my kids someday as a reminder, because it worked so well.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing, the idea that they could be so forthright in their humanness, because I remember the day that I realized that my dad was human, that the pedal stool was, he's still on a pedestal as my mentor and all of these things, but like you realize they're not infallible. And for them to go out of their way to actually point that out to you, I think sounds really powerful. Like, why do you think people don't do that, that parents wouldn't come out and say that? Is it a pride thing, an ego thing, a lack of thinking about it thing?
I think that my parents probably offered it up because it was an honest and genuine sentiment that they were expressing because of, frankly, positions that I put them in, which was I was challenging them as a parent. I was challenging them as a child. I'm also equally blessed in that I have my mom's side of the family passed away when she was young, but my father's side of the family are relatively young, and so I would have grandparents and great grandparents, and my grandfather, who actually just passed away, my grandfather Harold Elice, passed away just about a month ago or so. He is the definition of a patriarch to the family. Like he was to my father and my uncle, his brother, and even to my mother when she married into the family. And so I always felt like there was this prevailing wisdom that extended from him as to sort of the right thing to do. And my father and, my uncle, who are far more like my grandmother, and, almost none of us are like my grandfather in terms of his sort of stoicism and his can-do attitude. I like literally have a picture of him right here. I keep
Oh, wow.
younger. That is, a reminder of how much, you talk about like a true hero. But I think that was true for everybody in my family. And so I think sometimes advice like that I don't know if I can even directly attribute it to him, I think it stemmed from, my parents' own understanding of what the right thing to do was. And the right thing to do as a parent is to know when it's time to like serve as the example for your kids and say, this is the way to do it.
Yeah.
I don't know that I am so into the idea of like, be honest with your kids about, the things you did. I don't know if I agree with that. Julie Bowen has a very funny line in an episode of Modern Family where she says, like, you don't want your kids to, know who you were. You want your kids to know that you were the people you want them to think that you were. So,
I remember that line.
I massacred it a little bit. Sorry, Steve Levitan and Chris Lloyd, but it's and Julie Bowen, but it's a true line. And I think that, so I don't always necessarily believe that you want to be forthright, but I think that in knowing when it's time to be forthright, you talked about bringing your own father up of his pedestal. I mean, for me, an important point in the maturation of any young man or woman, maybe especially a young man, is that usually comes in your teenage years, and your parents, your teacher can do this too. They say something, it's something you've heard before. It's a variation on the thing. And as soon as you hear it, you suddenly go, for the first time in your life with absolute clarity, you go, I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's right.
Yeah.
I am going to call bullshit on that now. And of course, that's the thing that usually sends you a little bit down the road of thinking, everything is a teenager.
It is indeed.
But I actually think that, whereas usually that's a mistake on the part of your parents, that's like probably some kind of, momentary, miscalculation that reveals themselves. I think that when they do it intentionally, and again, that's part of the, the brilliance and the responsibility of being a parent, is you have to know not just what to teach your kids, but sort of how and when to teach them. So, I think that even through the things that were hard for me with my family, what always, held us together was this idea that they were doing their best and they loved me.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, to keep thinking about that in mind, it's a good segue to ask you, like, when it comes to keeping your 5-year-old, your 18 or your 20-month-old, no big deal yet, but 5-year-old, trying to keep her in her lane, like, what do you do to, I hate the word discipline or punish, but like to help guide?
No, I think it's, well, so I first of all, I don't, as a writer, I don't object to any words. I think they're important. And I think to sometimes try to break them down to their core intention and meaning is more crucial. Mm-hmm. So I actually think discipline is an important part of being a parent. I think it's, especially as a dad, I think it's sometimes the hard thing. Talk about a cliche, the old, it'll hurt me more than it hurts you. Like, I kind of get that. Mm-hmm. And I have not had to sort of discipline my child in such a way that it rises to that level per se. But we have gotten to the point with our 5-year-old where, you know, whether it's okay, like you're now going to bed without certain things, or it's just a discipline of, let me even take it out of the context of a kid being disciplined, like disciplining ourselves. Like we had a course correct on phones and screens. You know, we were doing the thing of sort of, here's the phone, here's this, sort of indiscriminately, kind of if the moment called for it.
Yeah.
And I don't agree to that anymore. In fact, me and my wife, it probably took me a little bit longer to come around to it, have realized that screens are not good. And I think it is okay for us as parents to decide it's not good. Now, whether it's, you know, hey, it's TV and you want to sort of limit it. I mean, I watch a lot of TV, or you want to, you know, allow them to have it at whatever amounts of time, and if they've performed whatever tasks, you know, good deeds, all of that I think is fine. I just think you have to have that discipline, self-discipline and discipline of them. But I'll tell you another thing in terms of sort of helping to guide me. One thing that I did, and maybe this was my grandfather who sort of inspired me a little bit, but I believe we live in a tricky world at the moment. And between social media and, you know, the news, and frankly, even just the kind of social pressures we feel from parents and friends, even when it's unintentional. God, I love my mother literally to death. She's from New York, but there are times I tell her something and she says like, well, you have to do this. And I kind of go, you've been living in New York for too long. Like, you don't have to do that at all. But, you know, so whatever those things are, I think it can be sort of a tricky time. And, you know, one thing that I did shortly after my second daughter was born was I bought Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation. And I listened to it on audio and I reread it because I thought, you know, not that they did everything right and not that the baby boomers did everything wrong, but I want to go back to basics. Even a lot of these books I read, there were all these like equivocations and caveats and explanations. And I just thought, you know, here's the thing. Respecting your mother and father, like that's good, right? Like keeping your hands to yourself, like not, you know, sharing with your sister, not taking what doesn't belong to you, like sort of basic stuff. And I mean, I'm not trying to get all sort of like 10 commandments or anything like that, but I felt like, you know, when you're talking about the greatest generation, who, especially today, when I hear people complaining about what they have, it's like, we have no idea how good we have it. I mean, no idea how good we have it. And when you go back and you read the stories of these people who raised not one, not two, not three, but like 5 kids, and they all grew up to be, you know, contributing members of society, it's sort of like, I'm going to go listen to those people. And I did, and I read the book, and it's funny, I really describe it as getting back to basics. And, you know, frankly, a lot of that stuff led me back to like certain religious, you know, sentiments that I think kind of got away. But I believe that all begins with the family. You know, that's the beauty of being a family, is that you cultivate those ideas and you impart them to your children. And frankly, far more than, you know, who you vote for, or, you know, what shows you're watching that are popular, or even what you're talking about with your friends, you know, the way you impact the world, you know, if you're a person who's fortunate enough to be a parent and have this option, is in what you know, impart to your children. So, you know, discipline is one component of that. You know, it's not just, I mean, I have like, you know, John Wooden, like I went back to basics, right? You know, like I did, I like Leo Tolstoy, I went back to basics, right? Like Oprah Winfrey, went back to basics. In fact, I'll tell you a great piece of advice I got from Shonda Rhimes, because again, I like to give credit where credit's due. Shonda Rhimes has a book called, I think it's like The Book of Yes. And the premise of the book has nothing to do with parenting. It was about her coming out of her shell and saying yes to things, with all these great opportunities were coming her way. But there's a chapter in the book where she talks about her kids wanting to do something with her. And initially, she starts to say no because she's saying yes to one of these other things that she has said yes to, in keeping with her mandate. And what she realizes is that saying yes is as much about saying yes to her kids, which is sort of saying yes to her as a mother. And she even says this thing in a very pragmatic piece of advice. She says, you know, how much do they really want? Like 15 minutes to 20 minutes? And yeah, sometimes it does, you know, become more than that. And I know one of your guests, I think one time talked about how it can evolve into more. You know, you have to be willing to, you know, not, again, you have to, you know, walk the walk, right? So when my daughter wants my attention, yes, there are times that I am, you know, focused. And I try to tell her when that is so she knows. But most of the time I kind of say, you know, buck up, Jeremy. Like, she's 5 and she ain't going to be 5 forever. And, you know, you can refocus and get back to what you're doing, but she's not going to ask you to look at that next picture if you don't look at it now.
Yeah.
And by the way, nothing you're writing is going to be as good as what she just drew. So get the fuck up and go look at it. You know, like, give her the love that you are going to crave from them. You know, I think so much of kids, you talk about discipline, like it's never tell them something once and they get it. It's like it's like you got to Mr. Miyagi them, right? You got to like tell them something that they don't even know what it is. And then, you know, maybe 16 years from now, they're going to make a right decision because of something you taught them. And, you know, you may not even be around, who knows, but like, that's your job. I don't know. It's what it means to me.
Couldn't be more true, especially at this age. You see even 5-year-olds being assholes because their parents are assholes. Like, you know, you're doing this to them. It's the environment doing that to them because they're born these pure, beautiful things that want to do great things, and we got to get out of their way so we don't fuck them up.
Yeah, well, you know, yeah, yes and no. I mean, you know, kids say some crazy shit when they're young, and it pays to like be able to say to them, hey, that's not right, or, you know, that's not the way we're going to do it anymore, and kind of put them on track, because, you know, otherwise what are you doing? There's a good you know, Jordan Peterson, I think it's like chapter 5 of his book 12 Rules, says, you know, what did he say? I even like wrote it down. Don't let your kids do anything that makes you not like them.
Yeah.
You know, that's like solid advice. If you know, people say, like, do you love your kids equally? And, you know, yeah, of course. And you supposedly love them, you know, unequivocally, but you still want to like them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how are you going to get to like them if you're not trying to teach them how to be a good person?
Yeah.
And I got to be honest with you, like, if you're not sort of devising for yourself what those things mean, right? Mm-hmm. And if you weren't lucky, like I was lucky to have parents who, even when you didn't agree, or even when they were screwing up, imparted to you important things. And, you know, and I frankly had other people, extended family, who were able to do the same thing, then I honestly think it's incumbent on you as a father or a mother to go out and figure out what those things are.
Yeah.
You know, devise your philosophy, come up with your family crest, so to speak. Right. I mean, you know, to put it bluntly, like, what the hell else are you doing? That's so important.
Can you give a good first step for somebody that's not inclined to do something like that?
I think the first thing I would say to anybody is that recognize that you'll take the first step multiple times. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think that whether it's business or it's life, it's writing, you know, it's going and working out, it's meditation, you know, oftentimes, by the way, it's like the tools that I think can be helpful towards making you just, you know, a good father or mother or a good person, by the way.
Right.
Unless you're like John Glenn, right? Unless you're like one of those astronaut guys who's like, I'm doing it tomorrow. And then, you know, like, you know, and you start doing it. If you're like most of us, like, you take the first step multiple times, you know, and then you take the third and the fourth step multiple times, and there are setbacks. But I think that I say that because if you can sort of know that up front, you know, and I know you've had Jesse Itzler on, and he's talked about David Goggins, but, you know, his book is a prime example. I love his book because he talks about when he made that determination to, like, do it. Turns out he didn't do it. He failed the first time, went back to his apartment and drank the chocolate shake and sat there in abject failure. Yeah. Then he said, I want this. I got to get up. So I think the answer to your question about what's the thing to do, it's this. It's take a second, take a few minutes, do it every day, you know, get quiet and figure out what's important to you. And if what's important to you, for the sake of this podcast, is your children and your future as a family, and even for that matter, your career, then really hammer down, focus in on that, you know, and make that your priority. And then at that point, start anywhere. Yeah. Pick a podcast. You like Tyler Ross, you think he's a smart guy, you think he's got something to say. Well, his best friend interviewed him, and he interviewed his best friends. And if you want more of a celebrity thing, there's Jesse Itzler. And if you're smart, you're going to follow Jesse Itzler to David Goggins, and you're going to realize that's got nothing to do with kids, but maybe there's some good discipline there. Mm-hmm. And, you know, by the way, my favorite parts of Living with the SEAL are the parts where, like, you know, he starts talking to him about life stuff. Like, he tells Sarah Blakely, like, yeah, here's your escape plan for getting out of New York, and he's got an inflatable air mattress. You know, Sarah Blakely's like, what are you, I'm going to go 14 floors down in my building in New York, hump across the city in the middle of a national emergency, and row myself to safety with my 2 kids. And David Goggins goes like, yeah. That's fucking exactly what you're going to do.
Protect your primary.
Yeah. You know, because and look, I have a picture of my wife where she's like just hugging our second daughter, but she has this look in her eyes. And I love it because I just think it's like, it's mama bear, do not, tread at your own risk. Do not cross that, because what you're looking at is definitive purpose.
Yeah.
And I think that if you can access definitive purpose, if you can access the idea that what's important is that you want this, then start anywhere. Start anywhere. Pick up a book that has fatherhood in the title. If you must, start with one of those sort of traditional, parenting books just to get an idea.
Yeah.
And go with the people who feel right to you, because honestly, if you're listening to people, chances are you're not listening to somebody who's going to give you like insane advice. Yeah. And by the way, here's and stay, and by that I do not mean anything political. So when I say, I don't mean that you should go to YouTube for advice on whether or not to vaccinate your kid.
Yeah.
I'm talking about more philosophical things.
Yeah, I've found that, and I've said it a couple of times. I think as a parent, it's your obligation to become the best human you can be, so that you can be a better parent or a better worker. Do you find that cultivating your own self is a good place to start, or take the focus outside?
I think that the ultimate mirror of your own, self capability. Self-reliance is a word that I really appreciate and I sort of seek in life as a trait. But the only way you can, one of the, sort of, I think, true mirrors of that is your own kids. There have been some good people who've raised some shitty kids,
mm-hmm.
but, which doesn't make them shitty people necessarily, but it does mean that the way they went about it, or perhaps the environment that they subjected their kids to was not the best one.
Yeah.
And, for me, I can't fathom a scenario where how my kids turn out is a backseat to anything. I can't. And I'd give up everything for them, because my attitude is I'll battle back on the other stuff.
Yeah.
There's a story of Edison. I think it's one of Ryan Holiday's books, again, that he talks about where and I think this is a good business one and it's a good life one. It's a good father one, where middle of the night, he's woken up and his factory is burning down. Something caught fire and the whole thing is burnt to the ground. All of that work, it would be like, Apple burning to the ground. And in the middle of this, where he's standing there with his employees and the fire engine is, trying to put out the blaze, he races off and he goes and he wakes up his wife and his kids and he goes, come out. You got to see this. And he stands there with his kids and he puts his arm around him and, puts one of the kids up on his shoulders. And he's like, look at this. And, his like right-hand man wanders over to him and goes, what are you doing? How the heck can you even have this attitude? And he said, look, here's the thing. We can rebuild that, and we will rebuild that. But I want him to say it. It's a sight to behold.
That's so incredibly present.
Massacring the story, but yeah, like it's there are all these videos on YouTube of people who've made it to be 90 or 100 years old, and when they ask them what's important, when they talk about what matters to them, I mean, through and through, it's family, it's friends who ultimately became family. It's the memories of the times with those people. And, one thing I was lucky about was I had kids a little bit later in life. I was in my 30s. And by the way, my parents were in their 20s. They kid me when I was 21, my father, and 24, my mother. I mean, if I were that young, my kid would be 18 right now. Let me tell you something. You would not have me on this podcast if I had kids that young, because they would be screwed up. Because I didn't know myself enough. I wasn't sort of, secure enough in myself to be able to I think, answer some of these questions the way that I have and my wife has. But look, again, you play the hand that's dealt you. And if you're a 20-something-year-old with a kid, I don't think that's an excuse.
Yeah.
You get your ass in gear, be responsible, and recognize that when you're 100, right? Like, what you're going to look back on is not your jobs or your promotions or even honestly the great works of art that you may have done, or the great plays if you join the NBA, whatever. Like, because that will pass you by. At some point you become a footnote, but like your kids, like, they'll remember you. I have a picture of my grandfather right there. He's present in my life every day still, as are other members of my family. And so I think that, that's what I believe in. And that's what I'm trying to cultivate with my own family and my kids.
That is awesome. Well, I hate that we're running short on time, so I'm going to jump into the lightning round questions.
Lightning round, man. Sure.
I may hit you up in a few months or another so that we can do this again. I've enjoyed talking to you so much.
Thank you. Me too.
Let's
I really appreciate you having me on, by the way.
Oh, 100% my pleasure. What's your greatest hope for your children?
That they find fulfillment.
If you were going to write a book about your life as a parent, what would be the name of some of the chapters?
It's funny. I heard you. I think Matt gave a good answer to that one. I thought when I heard it, I thought, oh, that's a tough one to top. You know, I'm going to pass for a second. I'll think about it. I don't think I have a good answer for that one. They would be fortune cookie answers.
Fair. Well, I'll give you one that's right in your wheelhouse then. So, well, first we'll start with the teaser. What television show or movie do you enjoy watching most with your daughter?
Oh, well, you know, we are, so the obvious answer to that is we watch all of the sort of like Pixar Disney. So, you know, from Moana to Incredibles to, you know, and Chris Meledandri and Illumination and all those guys, the Minions, we love all of that. Despicable Me was a particularly good one for me as a dad. What I've enjoyed is there's a host of movies that I'm waiting for them to see, which as a dad, I'm particularly keen on showing to them. Mm-hmm. But I really enjoyed things like, for instance, when my daughter, like when I showed her, you know, Snoopy and Charlie Brown and Peanuts, and she was into it. The big score for me as a dad. Like I have taught my 5-year-old that if you want to understand the essence of comedy, and she now understands it, you need to watch you need to watch Bugs Bunny and the Roadrunner movie, and you need to watch Chuck Jones do the Daffy Duck as Robin Hood. You want to understand comedy? For anybody who's watching this who wants to be a writer and wants to understand comedy, Daffy Duck as you know, Robin Hood, and Porky Pig as Friar Tuck is literally great. And so I watched that with my daughter, and she like sings the song, and she walks around the house going, you know, zoinks and away. And so I can't think of anything else that's just better than that. It's the greatest.
That's awesome. So who's your favorite television dad?
My favorite television dad? That's a good question. I'm going to answer that one in a sort of unconventional way. You know, I heard some of the sort of Family Ties answers and things like that, which I think growing up in that era is good. But I'll tell you a dad I really liked who was really popular, and I thought it was a good use of him being a dad. Kiefer Sutherland in the first season of 24. Okay, and I'll tell you why. Yeah. Here's why, and it's a testament to the writing. Since I'm a writer, I'll give Howard Gordon and oh, forgive me, guys, that I'm blanking on their names. The creators of 24. Yeah. This is what happens when you're nervous. I'm having my Jeopardy moment. But the reason I say Kiefer Sutherland is because the whole first season of that show, in particular the first half of the first season and the whole pilot is, you know, this guy has sort of rekindled this relationship with his wife. And in the middle of it, you know, Alicia Cuthbert, who plays his daughter, Kim, sort of goes out and pulls like a classic teenage stunt, right? I'm staying over at Kathy's house and she's going out with a couple guys. Yeah. And so, you know, he is, and the sort of thing about the president and all the stuff that's the political intrigue, by the way, Joel Surnow and Bob Cochran and Joel Surnow, there you go, creators of 24. All the political intrigue that sort of drives the pilot is kind of secondary to the idea that his wife keeps calling him and keeps saying, like, I'm looking for Kim and now I'm going out and I found another father. And, you know, so you get to this point in the pilot where he goes to see his boss about something political and the guy stands in his way. And, you know, Kiefer Sutherland within 30 seconds is like tasing him down on the ground. And, you know, this became sort of a staple, almost a comedic staple of the show, that he would do whatever he needed. But why I love it was because to me, you watch that pilot, and as a dad, let me tell you something. Like if my daughter's like missing and I have to deal with that, and then I get called in on a work thing, here's how it's going to go. I'm going to tell you one time what we're doing. And if the second time you disagree with me, I'm going to tase your ass. I got to go find my daughter. So Kiefer Sutherland to me was a great dad in the first season of 24.
I'm going to rewatch that pilot.
Yeah, man. He, you know, it's John McClane in Die Hard. You know, I mean, he saves his wife, but it's the greatest. You know, it's you know, I do love in your title sequence that Liam Neeson and Taken shows up. I mean, I saw that movie on a business trip in New York. It's 2 a.m. I'm a movie fanatic. And, you know, at the end of that, I was like, you know, room service stained fingers, like standing up applauding. Like, to me, like, yeah, that's right. Like, you want to be a dad? Like, there you go. That's what you better be willing to do.
That's
So those are my
awesome.
guys.
Love that
Those are my
answer.
guys.
Absolutely. All right. So this is I don't know if you listen to Lewis House's podcast, School of Greatness, but I've
Sure,
had the good
course.
fortune of communicating with him a little bit. And a question he suggested that I ask is, when do you feel the most loved?
With my kids or in general? Is that sort of just in general?
It can be general, however you want to answer it.
You know, I think probably the answer for both in general and for my kids is sort of one and the same, which is whenever I'm with my family, really any time. But I mean, it's particularly on a weekend, on a Saturday that's like dedicated to family. And by extension, the more of my family. So I'm also fortunate to have a goddaughter and her younger sister and my wife's family who's here in LA and my mother and father and my sister and my niece who are in Maryland with their husband, so whenever I'm with these people, a couple years ago for a birthday, we all got together for my birthday and everybody was there. I'm never happier than that. I never feel a greater sense of warmth and security and comfort and, joy and purpose than when I'm with my family.
That's awesome. Awesome. So this is one of my favorite.
By the way, winning an Emmy is nice. I'll take that too. I'm probably pretty happy. So anybody's out there listening in the voting community, but being with my family.
Vote for Jeremy Ellis.
That's my answer for you. Yeah, vote for Jeremy Ellis.
So this is one of my favorite questions that Tim Ferriss asks about the billboard question.
The billboard, sure,
Yeah.
of course. So I like that I get to get asked that.
Yeah, you're on the highway,
billboard.
you get billboard to give a piece of advice to all the dads driving down the highway, and it has to fit on a billboard.
To all the dads, and it has to fit on a billboard. All right, I think I'll answer that in the spirit of kind of, I think simple is the best. My thing would probably be committed. And I think I would say that because what I realized, even going back to some of your questions about, how do you start? Where do you begin learning to be a good dad? What's words like discipline versus love or whatever. Like, even in terms of your relationship with your significant other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Husband, wife, whichever way, your relationship has worked itself out. There's this, we take for granted this idea that we're sort of prepared for these relationships and for these circumstances and these experiences just because we've done them, right? I got married, so I'm ready to be a husband. Well, I, fathered a kid, so I'm ready to be a dad. Yeah. And you're not, like you have to mentally decide, like, I'm committed to this, right? So like when you, for instance, think of your marriage vows, it's like, I set them, but then you think like in sickness and in health, right? Like in richer and in poorer. And it doesn't have to be hugely dramatic. Like I started a business. Like I could not have done it without my wife. She's given me peace of mind and financial support when it's been there. So when I say be committed, it's like, think about what that means, right? Like what it means to be committed to your significant other, right? What it means to be committed to your child. So I think if it were that, and I think it's, probably just basic enough that, you maybe would stop and think like, well, what does that mean? And committed is a good word. So.
That's a wonderful answer. That resonates with me a lot. It speaks to me. I learned from that answer. Thank you for that.
Sure, no problem. Either that or I would take John Wooden's Pyramid of Life and I'd slap it up on a billboard. Pyramid of Success.
Yeah.
I think that's a good one.
Slide to buy now.
Might be visually disorienting.
I'll re-ask another question, except I'll reframe it. The period of life that you're in now, if you were writing a chapter, what would you name the chapter of the period you're in now?
Oh yeah, boy, I'm failing as a writer. Let me, the period that I'm in now, what the problem is? I'm trying to think of something sort of clever, but I think that, what would I call it? It's so funny. I just told somebody this morning, I said, I think I'm bad at titles. I know there's like some great, it's fun. Oh, well, it's funny. This will sound like a terrible answer, but I mean, here's the really pretentious, but it would be more as a reminder to me. I would probably call it something like Lionheart, and I'll tell you why. Because one of the people who I've read about, who I admire greatly, sort of a hero of mine in life, is Teddy Roosevelt. And by the way, a guy who in many cases was maybe not necessarily the best father, was the worst father, had a particularly sort of awful kind of, his wife died the same day as kid. It was really kind of traumatic. But when he was growing up in his household, there's a great book that David McCullough wrote called Mornings on Horseback. That's the one, Mornings on Horseback by David McCullough. And they talk about their father, Teddy Roosevelt's father, who was the one who talked to him about overcoming asthma and said to him things like, you need to strengthen your body, and like didn't mince words for him. And they were so enamored with the father, who sadly passed away, fairly young relative to the kids, that he was called Lionheart.
Yeah.
They called him Lionheart. And so again, it sounds really, sounds a little silly, but I think in terms of at least as a powerful chapter title, that maybe doesn't initially mean what you might think it means. And frankly, I think the idea of a lion-hearted father is not a bad thing to be either. So maybe that.
Great. All right. So my second to last question, it could be something physical. It could be something, conjured from your mind, but a gift that you would give to every single father on the planet if given the opportunity.
Oh, that's a good question. A gift that you would give to every father if given the opportunity. Wow, that's a great question. What do you give to every father? I think, I don't know that this is really the right way to answer that question, because it sort of negates the universality of it. But I think what I believe in is I would give them a book. Mm-hmm. And your answer, the next question becomes, well, what book would you give them? And this is a little bit of the evasive part of my answer, but I think I would give them the book that, and you don't always know which one it is, right? Where it's the one that you read that clicks, it blows your mind. And obviously I would sort of try to gear these towards, fatherhood, but even to some degree, like, I'll tell you, like, I think The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho is a pretty good book, right? I think even the message of that book, which is like, you can't find the thing that you're looking for that's right here, it's right under the tree. Like, you have to travel out, right? You have to experience it. And so I think that there are lots of different, tales that encompass that idea. But I love books, so maybe for somebody it's going to be the Bible, for somebody else it's going to be, a piece of fiction that somebody loved. But if I could somehow put the book in everybody's hand that blew their mind and set them down the right path, that would be the one. That was what I would do.
That's awesome, Jeremy. Just awesome. Well,
yeah. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, before I ask,
either that or like earplugs, maybe, for all those toys that make noise.
Just a pocket full of lollipops or something.
Yeah, like a back brace and a gym membership. Maybe.
Yeah, there you go.
That would be my practical gift.
So before I ask my last question, I'll thank you so much for being here. I've so enjoyed this conversation. I've learned tons, and I know that everybody that listens to it, which I hope is a lot of people, learn as much as I did, for sure. So thank you for your time and you're sharing your experience and ideas. And thanks for Walking Dead particularly.
You're very welcome. That's nice of you to say. Thank you for having me on. Honestly, I really am a huge fan of the kind of content that you're putting out there. I mean, I admire it to the point of wanting to emulate it. I mean, I think even from a purely producer business point of view, I think it's great. I think do this for the next several years and build it up, and people like me continue to take sort of direction and inspiration from it. And so believe me when I say it's very much my pleasure to have done this, and I was really tickled to be asked. Thank you.
Thank you. So here's my last question. Should this recording last forever, and a message that you could convey to generations to come, it could be of love or advice or anything, but what's a message you'd like to share down the generation of Elices?
Yeah, it would probably be, family is everything. I really believe that. We have a toast we say in my family, La Familia Todos, which is, family is everything. And I think, there's the Hebrew equivalent of that as well. And I have like 2 girls, and so there's that whole last name change thing. But it's funny, I've realized, and in preparing myself for one day being the patriarch of my own family, I recognize that it's my job to be not just the steward of like the Elices, but it's now the Guzmans and the Carans and the Caprios and, anybody else who's, been a part of our lineage. And so I feel like I would just want anybody who is further down the line from me and mine to remember, where they came from, and, that there were some pretty spectacular people who sort of led to them being there, and family is everything. Don't forget it. They're the only ones who will have your back.
That's wonderful.